Okay, good morning everyone. We'll make a start. So good morning and welcome to the Price Index of Private Rents webinar. So my name is Chris Jenkins and I'm an Assistant Deputy Director of Prices Division at the Office for National Statistics. Before we start, I'm just going to touch on some of the housekeeping for today's webinar. So if we can move to the next slide, please, which is the second in a planned series of inflation-based webinars that we're going to be hosting. So in terms of the webinar today, today's webinar will be recorded by the Office for National Statistics and the recording will be distributed after the session. And in terms of questions, all questions throughout today's webinar can be submitted via Slido. So you can do this via the integrated Slido button at the top of your screen, the link in the chat box, or using code 34600 in the Slido app or website. And that functionality is now open to start asking questions. Next slide, please. So very quick look at the agenda for today. We've got quite a bit to get through and we'll aim to get to the question and answer session by around 11:40, 11:45. There has been a slight change of speaker. So Luke Michaelidis was due to present on the use of PIPR in wider inflation statistics, but Chris Payne has stepped in to cover that slot. So it's now my pleasure to hand over to Tony Cox, who's the chair of the Inflation Statistics User Group, for a few words.
Thanks, Chris, and welcome everyone to this webinar. This is, as Chris was saying, this is the second in a series of webinars that the Inflation Statistics User Group has arranged with the ONS to discuss its work to improve our measures of inflation. The first webinar in the series was held on the 29th of January, when the subject was the use of new data collection methods, for example, scanner data. This webinar is about how private rents are measured and incorporated in our inflation statistics. It's a particularly important subject as this component makes up a large percentage of the content of our inflation statistics. As Chris has said, there'll be a Q&A session at the end of the presentations, but the discussion can continue on the Stats User Network. So if you haven't already done so, please register for that. And with that, I'll hand back to Chris for the first presentation.
Thanks, Tony. So can we go to the next slide, please? So I'm going to provide a brief overview of the development of a rental price index within the ONS. Next slide, please. So the development of rents can be traced back to the early 2000s when the ONS were challenged to consider the development of a measure of owner-occupier housing costs, OOH, for inclusion in the Consumer Prices Index. In late 2010, the Consumer Prices Advisory Committee, CPAC, recommended rental equivalence as a potential option for the measurement of owner-occupier housing costs alongside the net acquisitions approach. So rental equivalence basically values the housing services you get from your house by looking at what it will cost to rent an equivalent property. So it's heavily reliant on a comprehensive and robust rental price index. So around 2011, we identified rents data from the Valuation Office Agency as the best potential source of rents data for England, with similar data from Welsh and Scottish governments. And an initial methodology for producing a rental price index was developed and approved by CPAC in April 2012. So initially, due to Valuation Office Agency data sharing restrictions, which were laid down by the Commissioners of Revenue and Customs Act, there was no legal gateway to share the rental microdata we needed. So we were limited in the methodology that could be used. Initially, we were only able to use a basic matched pairs approach. Also, around 2012, the National Statisticians Review of Housing Market Statistics highlighted there was a notable gap in official statistics for a private rents price index. So there was this building need for the ONS to develop a comprehensive rental price index to plug this gap. A public consultation was carried out in 2012 on the recommended use of rental equivalents for OOH, and subsequently the National Statistician recommended the National Statistician's recommendation was approved by the UK Stats Authority in September 2012. So following this, the Consumer Price Index included owner-occupier housing costs, CPIH, was launched in March 2013, with the Experimental Index of Private Housing Rental Prices, IPHRP, launched in June 2013. The IPHRP was the predecessor of PIPR. So following the launch of CPIH and IPHRP, users questioned the price evolution of private rents, which was lower than expected and lower than ever published private measures of rental inflation. So a methods review was carried out, which identified several improvements to the process for replacing properties in our sample of rents. As a result, the IPHRP and subsequently OOH was now more responsive and more accurately represented price evolution in the sector. There was an average upward revision of around 0.1 percentage points on the published annual growth rates. The IPHRP was then revised in early 2015 with these improvements feeding through to the OOH in the March 2015 CPIH. In 2018, the IPHRP coverage was extended to include Northern Ireland data for the first time, so we were now able to produce a UK measure. So a key point I want to make here, not having access to the microdata limited the development of IPHRP, so we had to use the best methodology we could at the time. It was always our intention to gain access to the microdata so we could apply a more sophisticated methodology that would ultimately improve our measure of private rents. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go into full details here. This just summarizes the steps that have been taken to develop the price index of private rents, or PIPR, but there are a few notable milestones to pull out. So firstly, and a key milestone for us, we gained access to the VOA microdata in late 2019, and this was followed by microdata access for Wales and Scotland in the early 2020s. So this then allowed us to consider more sophisticated methods for producing a rental price index, which we'll explain later in this webinar. And that would allow us to utilise more of the data available to us and produce robust estimates at a more granular level, addressing the limitation of IPHRP. So the progress was slowed somewhat by COVID, with resources being diverted elsewhere during this period. However, the Great British PIPR was successfully launched in March 2024, and this ultimately replaced the IPHRP at this point. This was then further extended to cover Northern Ireland in March 2025, meaning full coverage of the UK in PIPR for the first time. In October 2024, we then requested an initial quality-focused assessment of the PIPR by the Office for Statistics Regulation. This was simply the first step in trying to understand how well or not the PIPR met user needs. The OSR outlined several requirements for us to address before we could consider PIPR for a full assessment as an accredited official statistic. So since that report, we've been working to address the requirements, including lots of engagement activity, which included a user engagement survey in June 2025 and subsequent response in October 2025. And all of these documents are publicly available. Given the feedback that we received to all our engagement activity, we believe it has shown that the PIPR is meeting user needs, it's well established, and that our activities have had a positive impact on increasing user understanding of the methods used in the compilation of the PIPR. So for this reason, supported by the Head of Profession for Statistics Office, we removed the in-development status last month in May 2026, and PIPR is now an official statistic. Our next steps will be to work with the OSR for them to assess if all requirements have been sufficiently met, and then to consider the work needed to request an assessment of PIPR as an accredited official statistic. Next slide, please. So we believe PIPR is now a well-established statistic. The PIPR publishes both a measure of inflation and average rental price levels at a national, country, region, and local authority or broad rental market area, addressing the limitations with the old measure, IPHRP. So PIPR is a stock-based measure, so it's reflective of all existing rents. We currently don't have the data available to us to produce a separate flow-based measure, which will be reflective of new lets only, but we will continue to investigate this with our data providers. It should be noted there are some differences in data collection between countries which we use, and users should be aware of this. For example, Scotland rents data are mainly based on advertised new lets. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to touch on our future plans for PIPR engagement before we step into the methodology. Next slide, please. So throughout the development of the PIPR, we have worked extensively with our data providers, stakeholders and users to ensure the index met their needs and importantly was well understood. Since the OSR report, we have also updated and improved PIPR supporting documentation, including the publication of a comprehensive methodological paper, provided blogs, webinars and explainers to provide more accessible information on PIPR for users, and brought everything together in a quarterly update of our PIPR development plan. Now we have moved out of development and into a phase of continuous improvement. We will no longer publish this quarterly development plan. We will instead engage with users through the PIPR Statistical Bulletin, blogs, and the wider ONS plan for economic statistics. Also, we are keen to make more and better use of the Stats User Network, as Tony has mentioned, and we want to use this as the forum to engage not only on PIPR, but our wider inflation statistics. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. As mentioned at the start, today is the second in a series of inflation webinars hosted in conjunction with the Inflation Statistics User Group. And there are two main objectives. So firstly, the webinars are an opportunity for us to engage with users on some important inflation developments. This is the second in what is planned to be a series of webinars with more to follow, such as the consumer inflation landscape. And then secondly, along with the inflation statistics user group, we really want to reinvigorate the use of the stats user network and make it a popular forum for useful discussion across all our inflation statistics. I just want to spend 2 minutes to quickly demonstrate the stats user network for those of you who are new to this forum. Firstly, the link to the stats user network is in this slide, and I'll pop that in the chat once I've finished. You'll firstly need to register with the stats user network to post and contribute to discussions. So if you go on to the next slide, please. So this is the landing page for the stats user network once you've registered. And we are specifically interested in the prices and inflation group. So you'll need to use the explore option from the top toolbar, select groups, and then navigate to the prices and inflation group. On to the next slide, please. So this is the page that you will arrive at. This is the prices and inflation group landing page. So here you'll see all recent posts, but it also allows you to search back over previous posts, start a new discussion topic, or review events. So you can see on this screen, the last post in the group was about this webinar. If you go on to the next slide, please. So the stats user network works like a standard online forum. So you can create or you can click into a post or a new topic and add comments, ask questions, like content, or reply as needed. So this shows an example of the interaction possible, so with Jill Leyland asking a question and subsequently me replying. So at the ONS, we will commit to reviewing and replying along with adding new content as needed. And as a reminder, we will plan on using the stats user network as one of the avenues to provide updates on any future PIPR work. So I strongly encourage everyone to try and register and hope we start making good use of the stats user network to engage on our inflation statistics. Next slide. So I'm going to hand over to Amy North and Ian Boreham now, who will go into the methodology used to calculate the price index of private rents.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, hello everyone. Lovely to meet you all here today. My name is Amy North and I'm the head of the Housing Market Indices team within ONS. So it's my team who produce and publish the price index of private rents on a monthly basis. And I'm here with my colleague Ian today.
Yep, good morning everyone. I'm Ian Boreham and I led on the development work of the price index of private rents. If we go on to the next slide, please. So this morning, we're going to be taking you through an overview of the methodology we use to produce our PIPR. Obviously, today we've only got a short length of time, but if you did want more information, we have published a quality and methodology information, a QMI, and also last autumn we published the price index of private rents detailed methodology. So both these are available that give more information on our data sources and how we produce our price index. Today, we're going to cover our data collection, cleaning and linking processes, how we build a sample that we use for PIPR, our modeling processes, and then how we aggregate up to our published indices. I think it's important to remember that remember what the objective is for our PIPR, and that is we want to measure the average rental price that's being paid by all tenants across all the UK. There's a couple of methodological choices that we've made in PIPR to achieve that. So one is we use our double imputation hedonic regression model, which is associated with the annually updated fixed basket of properties. This we do to allow us to control for the changing composition of properties in our collections from month to month and allows us to produce a pure price index. This method suits the quality and the volume of data that we have available to us in the ONS and is one of the recommended methods in Eurostat's handbook on residential property price indices. The other key choice we've made is we use expenditure weights when we aggregate indices up from a collection up to a UK level. And these allow us to control for over or under collection in our enterprise data and ensure that our index is representative again of the whole of the UK. I'll hand you back now to Amy, who'll be taking you through our bathtub model.
Thank you, Ian. So if I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So we sometimes get queries about how the stock measure of rental price inflation that we publish at ONS compares with the private sector measures of the flow of rents, such as by HomeLet and Rightmove. So in a given month, there are going to be a minority of rents which are for tenancies that have just started in the latest month, and that particular property may have seen a price change compared with the rent that was paid by the previous tenancy at that property. So we would call this a new rent. There's also going to be some people who have stayed in the same property, but perhaps they've renewed their agreement with their landlords. Maybe it's been an annual review of the rent price, and that we would term as a renewal. Observed market behaviour suggests that renewal price inflation tends to be lower at a lower rate than for new lets. And we also know that there is a far greater number of people who are already in existing tenancies who won't have signed a new contract this month, and their price will have remained the same and not changed in the latest month, since rent price doesn't generally tend to change month to month to month when someone is renting. So if you just used new lets, whether that's an advertised price or an achieved and actual rent price that's been paid, then you would be measuring what we call the flow of rents. And that's what most private sector measures are doing. As Ian mentioned, with PIPR, we are trying to measure the price inflation averaged over the entire private rental stock, which means we want to measure the average inflation rate that's averaged over all of new rents, renewals and existing tenancies, which is the stock of rents. So the rate of price inflation for the stock of rents will by definition be different from the inflation rate for new lets only. And it can help if you think about this in terms of a bathtub of water. So water coming out of the tap will represent the flow of new lets inflation that's coming into the bathtub, while the water in the bathtub itself represents all rents, new lets, but also existing and renewals that are in the water. And generally, water coming out of that tap is hotter than the bath water and reflects the immediate market conditions that are affecting new people trying to seek new tenancies, and existing tenants are not exposed to that market currently. It takes time for the hot water from the tap to affect the overall temperature of the tub, and indeed we would never expect the tub to reach the exact temperature of the hot tap, but the temperature in the hot tap will influence the water in the bathtub. So flow measures of rent inflation can be taken as a leading indicator of what we might expect the bathtub temperature to do in the coming future. It would be really interesting for us to be able to produce a stock measure of rents and a flow measure of rents, but unfortunately the data that's collected by our data suppliers does not collect the information that we would require for us to identify which properties are new rents and which are for renewals or existing lets, to let us split the data to analyse this. So we don't currently have the data to produce a flow measure at this time. At the next slide, please. So just quickly to demonstrate, in this chart we have got the stock measure of PIPR plotted in dark blue, and we've also added Rightmove and Zoopla to this chart, which are flow measures. And you can see here how the stock and the flow relate. So you can see how PIPR's stock measure is less dynamic than the inflation of the newly advertised rents, and it never meets the same peaks and troughs that Rightmove and Zoopla's meets. Next slide, please. So we have been working with users with feedback survey and engagement from last year and elsewhere in the description that Chris gave at the start. And there have been some questions around how the 14-month validity period works in PIPR. So I'm going to cover this in detail now. For something like a bottle of milk, say, we could go to a shop in January, find that bottle of milk, see it costs £1, then come back the next month, find the same bottle of milk, see that it costs £1.05, and say, okay, there's been a monthly inflation rate of 5%. But for private rents, there's no such equivalent. There's no supermarket we can go to that lists all the privately rented properties in the country, what their current rent price is this month. There are millions of privately rented properties, and our data suppliers collect over 500,000 rents each year, which we gain access to. And ideally, we would collect a rent price for every property in that sample every month, but it's simply not feasible for our data suppliers to be able to do this and collect a price every month. But there is hope. In practice, rent price does not change for every tenant for every month. It stays constant for a period of time when you're within contract usually. So if we collect a rent price of £500 in January and we manage to get an updated rent price for that same property in February and in March, we would expect that for the vast majority of the time, the price will have remained the same as January. It will remain the same for a period of time until the rent price changes, perhaps upon a change of tenancy, or perhaps an annual rent review or something of the like. And indeed, previous analysis have been published saying that rental agreements often keep a constant rent price for 6, 12 or 24 months. And in recent years, there have been some policy changes across the UK, which have encouraged landlords to change their rent price at most once per year. So taking this and in combination with the operational collection processes that our data suppliers use leads us to use this 14-month validity period modelling assumption to let us handle not having updated data for every property every month without depleting the sample, to let us produce robust, reliable estimates. So once we have received an updated price from a property, we will assume that that price remains valid and stays the same for up to a maximum of 14 months, unless we receive an update for that property in the meantime, in which case we discard the old record and we replace it with the latest information we have for that given property. So that price could be higher or lower or the same as the previously recorded price for that property. At that point, we reset our validity period, it restarts at 1 and we start again. If a property doesn't have an updated price for it collected by the end of the validity period, we consider it more likely that there could have been a change in rent price or indeed a change in tenancy, and the record is dropped from our sample. So on the next slide, I'm going to go through a simple example to show how this works. So let's pretend that in the 14 months to July 2024, we have only collected rents data for 3 properties, property A, B and C. In reality, this is over 500,000 rents, but here we've got 3. The price for property A was collected in October 2023 and we haven't had an update for it since. So by July 2024, this rent record is 10 months old. The validity age for B and C are 6 and 7 months respectively. So that would be the data that would go into our regression model for our July 2024 calculation. The next month in August 2024, our supplier collects an update for properties B and C, and both have seen a price increase since the last collection. So we discard the old prices and replace property B, property C's records with the new price and reset the validity period age to 1. We didn't get a price update for A, but the previous record was still collected within the last 14 months, and that is within the validity period, so we carry forward its rent price unchanged. Note now that for the August 2024 model, we are only using the most recent rent price for each property for the regression model. The model does not know that B or C's price used to be 600 or 1,000 respectively. It only knows what the current price is for each property, since we're aiming to measure what tenants are currently paying now, not what they used to pay. Fast forward to December 2024, we've not had any further updates for property B and C, so their validity age is now 5. That's within our 14 months, so we carry forward that price. And that represents the majority of tenancies which do not experience a price change every few months. So we consider it valid that that price has likely not changed in that time. But we still have not had an update for property A, unfortunately. So for December 2024's model, the validity age would have become 15, which is beyond our 14-month limit. So we drop A from the sample. We do not use that in our regression model to calculate the indices. We discard it completely. The model has no idea that record existed. But we have collected for a new property, property D, this month. So we would add property D to our data set with validity age 1, and the regression model would use property D, B and C to calculate our inflation rate for December 2024. So our approach means we only ever use the latest month's price for every property we have in our data set to calculate our indices. And that could be either the previous month's price copied forward or the updated price that we've just received in the latest month. We don't take an average, we don't do a 14-month average of all prices that we have for any given property in that period. And that enables us to represent the rented stock as opposed to the flow. And I'll pass back to Ian now to summarise our monthly flow.
Yep, thank you again, Amy. So having collected our sample, we then go to the monthly processing flow for PIPR. In an overview, we'll take our price data and our attributes data, take it through a cleaning process, and then link them together. This allows us to maximize the amount of information that we have available for each individual property. We use imputation to fill in missing characteristics. And having done so, we then put every property for that month's sample into a hedonic regression model, which takes the latest rental price data and estimates the marginal contribution of each property characteristic towards the rental price paid. We use these coefficients on each property in our fixed basket to produce a predicted price for that fixed basket. We then repeat this monthly processing on a monthly basis, and this allows us to calculate the pure price inflation rate for the properties within our fixed basket. We group properties in our fixed basket into strata, that is effectively local authority by property type, by furnished status, and use these to calculate elementary aggregates at the strata level. These are then aggregated into higher levels using our expenditure weights, and from these we produce the chained indices from which we use to publish PIPR data. I'll pass you back now to Amy to take you through some of our linking processes.
Thank you. Thank you. So to account for changes in the composition and quality to let us produce a pure price inflation index, we need to know the characteristics or attributes of a property. These represent the important attributes that we look for when renting a property and determining the price that we're willing to pay for that property. So for example, the location of it, the size of the property, the type of property, and so on. So we at ONS can't collect all of that data ourselves, so we use administrative data that's already collected primarily by other government departments for their own regulatory function. And since these administrative data collections were not designed for our specific use for measuring property price inflation in PIPR, we need to link multiple data sets together to get all of the information that we need for our model. So rents data collection processes are different for each UK country. Because of this, we do advise caution when you compare rent estimates between countries, and there's more information on this in our bulletin and in our QMI and our quad. So our regression model is slightly different for each country. Ian will talk about it later, but there are full details on the slides. But because of but generally, what we do is we take rent price data, which is listed on the left, and that provides number of bedrooms, the property type, the furnished status, rent price, and attributes data, which is listed on the right, provides things like floor area and property age. We use UPRM, which is the unique property reference number, to link at the individual property level for England and Wales, which is from HMRC's Valuation Office and Welsh Government, to link to the property attributes data for England and Wales, which comes from HMRC's Valuation Office Council Tax Valuation List. For Northern Ireland, we link the equivalent Northern Ireland's Housing Executive rents price data with the Land and Property Services Northern Ireland's property attributes data to get the same sort of information. And for Scotland properties, we get the Scottish Government's rent price data, and that includes property age as well. We get that from that data source. For all parts of the UK, all 4 countries there, we use postcode to assign the ACORN group to each individual property, and ACORN is a measure of affluence for the area. We also use the National Statistics postcode lookup to obtain local authority code, and that is used as a variable in our regression model for England and Wales. And Scottish Government and Northern Ireland Housing Executive each provide us with a lookup, which we use to assign the broad rental market area to each property in our data for us to use in the model, to use BRMA instead of local authority. And I'll move on to the next slide, please. Once we've linked all of this data together, we do have to account for any values which are missing. For example, we might not have the floor area for one of our properties in the data set. So what do we do here? Well, for our monthly data set, which is what feeds into our regression model, we use a decision tree regressor imputation for floor area as the continuous variable. And for all the other price determining characteristics in our model, which are categorical variables, we set these to a missing category a missing indicator if it's not populated. For the annual fixed basket, it's slightly different. We use the same decision tree regressor imputation for floor area, so we don't have a zero or missing floor area for any individual property. But for the categorical variables, we don't want there to be any missings in our fixed basket. We need to have a number of rooms, a property type for each property in our basket. So we impute, instead of setting to a missing indicator in our fixed basket, we use the decision tree classifier for these variables to ensure that we have a non-zero value, a populated value for all of our categorical variables. And now I'll pass on to Ian to talk through the rest of the monthly process.
Yep, thank you, Amy. Having linked and imputed our sample, it's then run through the double hedonic regression model. This again estimates the marginal contribution that a given property characteristic has on the rental price paid. And this outputs, for our purposes, as a set of regression coefficients. This helps us estimate how much, for example, how much more rent the average tenant is paying to rent a 4-bedroom property compared with an otherwise equivalent 3-bedroom property. The table we've got displayed shows the variables that we use in the regression modeling for PIPR, and you can see which variables are used for different countries. Our research has shown that these were the key variables that provide us with good price determining characteristics, but were also available with sufficient quality for our use. I wanted to highlight at this stage that we use a separate regression model for each of the countries across the United Kingdom, and this has allowed us to tailor the model to optimize for the data availability within those countries, but also allows us to account for the differing data collection practices across the UK. Having produced the set of regression coefficients for each property, we then apply those to each property in our fixed basket and estimate the average rental price it would cost to rent those properties in the fixed basket in that month. We can then look at the change in predicted price in the fixed basket to estimate our pure price change. As we go on to the next slide, we can see how we use that to create our PIPR index. So from the regression modeling, we have estimated for every property in the fixed basket how that predicted price has changed over time. We then aggregate these up to the strata level, so that is either the local authority or the broad rental market area, and then by property type and by furnished status. We aggregate these using an unweighted geometric mean, but the key thing to reflect on is that every property in the fixed basket has an equal weight in the calculation of price change at the strata level. These indices, or these elementary aggregates at the strata level, we then aggregate up to higher levels such as local authority or country. This is where we bring in our expenditure weights. So our expenditure weights we calculate using survey data, dwelling stock data and price level, and we do that to estimate the average amount of money spent on rent as a total within each strata, so within each local authority, furnished status and property type. We use our expenditure weights to aggregate up, as I said, so local authority and country. The other output we produce from PIPR alongside the index and changes in prices is our price levels. These are calculated very similarly, where we take the fixed baskets for a given period, so currently January 2023, and use our price index to inflate the predicted price for that month to get the predicted price for the current period. So what I'll do now is I'm going to hand you over to Chris, who's going to show you how we use some of the outputs from our PIPR model to broader consumer price inflation.
Thank you, Ian. So my name is Chris Payne. I lead on some of continuous improvement work across our consumer price inflation statistics. And in this section, I wanted to talk to you a bit about some of the wider applications of PIPR across our range of consumer price inflation statistics. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So consumer price inflation statistics measure the change in price of the goods and services typically consumed by UK households, and this of course includes property rentals. Since 2024, the PIPR index now underpins the private rental components of our headline measures of inflation, which are the Consumer Prices Index, CPI, and the Consumer Prices Index, including owner-occupiers housing costs, which is CPIH. So for CPI, private rents lie in the actual rents component of the basket, and the private rents element of this is now based on PIPR and has been since February 2024. It's combined with other rents such as social rentals, registered social landlords, local authorities and UK holiday lets to complete the overall actual rentals item, and the weight of that in CPI is around 8.4%. For CPIH, PIPR data actually enters the index in two ways. So firstly, as part of the actual rentals component in the same way as CPI, but it has a lower weight, which is 6.7%. And the reason for that is the inclusion of owner-occupiers housing costs in CPIH, which is omitted from CPI. And that is the second use of the PIPR data. So as we use the rental equivalence approach to measure owner-occupiers housing costs, we use PIPR data to calculate the OOH component. It's slightly different to published data. We only used unfurnished properties in OOH, and these are weighted in a particular way. So they're weighted to reflect the stock of owner-occupied housing properties rather than the private rental stock. The OOH measure has a weight of just over 18% in 2026. So PIPR plays a very important role in monthly inflation. If we could go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. The next use I wanted to talk about is the household costs indices. So if you are not familiar with the household cost indices, these are a set of inflation measures that aim to reflect how households experience inflation. So whereas CPI and CPIH focus on inflation in the UK as a whole, the household cost indices focus more on how households are experiencing inflation. And the focus here is on different subgroups of the population. So inflation for income deciles, inflation for different tenure types, etc. There are a few differences between how the household cost indices are compiled relative to CPI and CPIH. Firstly, they have a slightly different weighting structure. So CPI and CPIH use what's called plutocratic weights, where you look at the total share of expenditure across the UK as a whole and weight different product groups accordingly. Because the household cost indices focus on households' experience of inflation, what we actually do is something called democratic weighting. And the idea here is that we use the average household's share of expenditure. Essentially, that gives every household an equal weight in the calculation. The measurement basis is slightly different as well. So the CPI and CPIH tend to focus on the price of acquiring goods and services, whereas many items in the HCIs are on a payments basis. So they look at how goods and services are paid for rather than just the price of acquiring them. For a lot of the basket, that doesn't make any difference, but there are some elements of the basket where it does, owner-occupied housing being a case in point here. You acquire housing when you exchange contracts, owner-occupied housing at least. You pay for housing through, say, a mortgage over a period of time, and you use housing services for the length of time that you're in the house for. So the idea behind the payments approach to owner-occupied housing costs is you try and capture those payments directly through mortgage interest payments, stamp duty, other factors. We could have the next slide, please. So how do the HCIs use rents data? So we have a rental component in the HCIs as well. We don't use it in quite the same way as we do in CPI and CPIH, where it's aggregated into an actual rentals category. We actually create three separate classes, one for private rentals, one for social and other rentals, and one for UK holiday rentals. The reason for that is because the focus is on different groups of households. Private renter households are unlikely to be social renter households and vice versa. So if we created one weight for all of these different types of payments, then we'd be conflating effects from social rents for private renters and from private rents for social renters. So it's important to separate those categories out. Overall, the private rental component of the all household HCIs is about 5.2%. That's similar to CPI once you remove the weight for local authority rents and other rents. For the private renter subgroup, which is one of our tenure type split, it's actually 30%. So you can see how much variation there is potentially by focusing on different subgroups of the population. And if we could just share the final slide, please. Thank you. So Here we've got the chart showing inflation rates for different tenure types. So we have 4 different tenure groups: private renters, social and other renters, mortgage and other owner occupiers, and outright owner occupiers. And you can see that the private renters have had the highest inflation rate since September 2024, currently at 3.7%. There's a lot more detail on this in our HCI bulletin. We published Q1 data last week. So please have a look if you'd like to find out more about that. Thank you very much. I will now pass you back to Chris. Thanks, Chris. Thanks to Amy and Ian as well.